Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen W. Long, and this is The Writing Life. We don't do this very often, but I've asked Jose Araguz to come back and join us again because I just don't think we were done last time. Jose is a professor at Linfield in poetry, and is it poetry and creative writing, or?
Creative writing in English.
In English,
Yeah.
okay. But is the emphasis on poetry? Or
Oh no, creative writing as a whole, like
Okay.
poetry, fiction, and nonfiction.
Oh, right, okay, good. But I think of you as a poet.
Yes.
Now, and I should have cleared this up earlier. Do you write other than poetry?
Yes. So for me, everything starts in my journals, and
Okay.
will usually start in lines as poems. But I write nonfiction essays. I've got one memoir that I'm shopping around, and I'm working on a new one this summer.
Oh boy.
And I have a short story collection that I'm slowly working on, and I recently got a short story published. So
Okay.
slowly, I think it would go in that order: poetry, creative nonfiction,
Okay.
and then fiction. And I think I blame it just because I can't tell a story. Like chronology escapes me, but I'm good at impression and
Okay.
evocation. So
And you know, that's interesting that you say that. I think when I read, some people are really sort of plot oriented, both as a writer and a reader. I'm not. I want that evocative, the language itself, or maybe you know some feeling that you get,
yeah.
which sounds like what you do. Well, I've got a couple of things that I want to hit on, and I told you I want to talk about your students.
Mm-hmm.
Is it fair to ask you for an overview? And maybe they're too diverse, but I just wonder, because we were just talking about freshmen, people just coming in, so 18, 19-year-olds. Are they hungry for poetry? Is it something that they just have to fill a slot with? And if that's the case, do you see them sort of grow and transition over the course of the year?
Yeah, I think it's a mix.
Okay.
My teaching, I started teaching maybe in 2004. Not maybe. In 2004, I was tutoring and adjuncting at a community college right after
Okay.
undergrad. This is down in Texas. Then I did some teaching during my MFA at NYU. And then in the interim between MFA and PhD, I did teaching in the community. So I would visit high schools and or just start a writing group and work that way. And then the PhD is where I started doing more of my classroom, like official, or hardcore kind of in the classroom things. And now at Linfield. In the classroom setting, both during my MFA and the PhD, there is a hunger for creative writing. The way some people put it, professors outside of the department, they'll be like, well, students want to take your classes, obviously. Like creative writing being something that students are happy to take and are interested. And that's,
I wondered in what spirit they said that.
It was both a little grumpy, but also a little, I mean, it's not a bad complaint, I think.
Sure.
Like, one, because it means students are interested more and more in their narratives and in expressing themselves, but also that creative writing as a field is growing in such a way that it's open to more and more people.
And let me slow you down at least. What do you mean by that? That it's more and more open?
I'll put it to you this way. When I was doing the PhD, I primarily taught composition classes, which is where you're supposed to write essays. That's the class. But my MO has always been like the world needs more poetry. So even in these classes that were very essay oriented, I would teach poems. I mean, what is it? The poet Billy Collins says that where a novel is kind of like a house guest that stays 3 weeks or something like that. A poem, conversely, is like someone you pass on the street.
Okay.
It's a little less intimidating. So I ask students, here's a poem, let's read it. Engage with it. What are the things?
Yeah.
And the conversations that I'm able to facilitate around a poem are really rich. And then my job's not done there. The job is to then connect those conversations with, well, this is how we apply it to essay writing and things.
Okay, so the poem is the springboard, maybe.
Yes.
Yeah, the starter.
Mm-hmm.
As you were talking, and I hadn't planned this, I just thought of it as you were describing that. Do you think that the electronics that we're exposed to, do you think that in any way encourages or inhibits or changes how younger people look at writing and
Well, that's something I try to make use of. I mean, we're definitely in a different world than we were 100 years ago. I want to say roughly 100 years ago was when I think Susan Sontag writes about this. She says about 100 years ago, it went from people saying when something like really impactful happens, they went from saying it was like a dream to it was like a movie. So movies had been around long enough for people to be like, well, that's the way we think now.
Sure.
And these days, the way the smartphones and the impact of social media has a similar effect. Where when I'm teaching either a composition class or a creative writing class, I always point people to the writing they do in their lives every day. So I ask, hey, how many of you have spent more than 5 minutes working on a text? Like, I mean, that's revising, that's creating,
right.
And also the kind of writing they do. Or the kind of reading they do on social media, because social media, people put in their own thoughts, but they also share articles, and I'm like, you're always reading and you're always writing. We're in a classroom. It's weird to be in a classroom, but it's also you're not here without any tools. So one of my very first things I do in the classroom is reassure students and point them to what they already know, and I think that helps because writing's intimidating. Even us at this point. Way along in our own paths of our writing life, it's still intimidating. It's like, oh, there's that one project that's really hard to work on, and that's the project you have to work on.
Of course.
And for students, that translates into essays. And so it's like, okay, here's how to not just write the essay, like the actual essay, but also how to think about it, how to psych yourself out, and also how to become comfortable getting into that space.
Okay. I've read fairly recently two. One was an autobiography, and one was a collection of letters and correspondence, and both of these had to do with World War II waves. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that struck me, particularly with the collection of letters, is they wrote paper and pen, I suspect. I don't think that these were even typed. And the time that it takes to dedicate to that, to correspond like that, because these would go on for pages, and you've done it, but to write a couple of pages, 3 pages of this is what I'm doing and how are you doing and so on, is more than 10 seconds on your phone. Mm-hmm. And I just wondered, it's not, so I'm saying it's not just the mechanism, it's not just the tool that you use. Does that change our thinking? Do we, are we, I don't know, maybe not as engaged, not as deeply engaged? I don't know, I wonder.
There are probably people much more smarter than I am who have all sorts of ideas and theories, and I think I've read some different articles and essays on this. The way I see your question relating to poetry and just writing in general is that for me, poetry is a way to refresh language. We're able to take phrases that we use every day, then bring them and then isolate them and think about them in a new way. So that's my end. I think that's why I teach with poems in whatever classroom I'm in, because it's one thing to be like, hey, you have to write 1,000-word essays. It's like, oh, I don't even know 1,000 words. But you hand someone a haiku, and they stop and they think, and suddenly they see something in nature a little differently. They're like, well, maybe I can do a little of that, and maybe I can enter some of that. So I won't say for sure that I know that it's making us think differently, but I don't know if that's good or bad. But poetry now, and I think always, has been a way to like philosophy. I think it makes people slow readers. It makes people slow down and really think about words. And anything that makes people do that is great.
Is worthwhile.
Yeah.
I remember hearing and reading that because of movies, our storytelling has evolved in this way. If this was even Mark Twain, but let's say even before that, stories were basically narration because that was the presentation of the written word. When we all got used to watching movies, even written stories became scenes, which is sort of different than a narration, and certainly different than author intrusion. So at some point, we kind of don't say anymore, "Dear reader," when we're writing. And again, I just wonder what that does to us as a people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if we're talking just the word scene, I mean, we stole movies stole that from plays. So it's like,
Of course.
so this idea of like providing a context and a setup, a scene, translates into movies, and movies become this very popular thing. And TV, a lot of good writing on TV. But yeah, it is our one of the main forms of storytelling these days. And yeah, our conversations, my conversation in the classroom with my students, will more or less often involve trying to gauge what movie have they all seen.
Right.
Because
Yeah,
then I
okay.
can just point to scenes and be like, how this one thing happened in that movie, well, this is how it relates to this.
Right.
The most recent example that sticks out is I had one class that, of all the movies that I kept trying to like cite examples from, Ratatouille, the Pixar
Right.
movie with the rat, that was the one they knew the best. So I'm like, I'm sorry guys, you need to watch better movies. It's going to be Ratatouille until that happens. But it's a useful way to, in the same way where I'm like, hey, the way you text when you're outside the classroom, those skills apply into writing inside the classroom. Same thing with, hey, the storytelling you see out in the world is similar to what we're going to be studying in the classroom. You're just needing to learn the rules and the context of it.
Yeah. I took a class one time that I just loved, and it was the structure was Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, and so the hero's journey, but because movies were so ubiquitous and we've sort of all seen the same movies, he used scenes from movies to demonstrate the journey as opposed to scenes from a book, because we read different books. But and which leads me to something else. A best-selling book is, pick a number, 50,000 books, I don't know. And if you sold 50,000 movie tickets, the thing would be a flop. So, just more people see movies than read books.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, and I don't want to run out of time. Let's skip around a little bit.
Sure.
Last time we talked, this is the part that I didn't think we finished. You're bilingual.
Yes.
What a wonderful attribute, a skill. And I've thought about what, that's another tool in your toolkit. What can you do? I would think in some instances a word in Spanish or English is just the right word where it's not available in the other. Or, because I'm not bilingual, am I wrong? When you pick a language to write in, what motivates that language?
What motivates the language, or what motivates the poem? I think it's for me, it's more, what is the, W.S. Merwin talks about sitting down every day and just listening. So whatever my ear picks up is where the direction I go in. And for me, it becomes a matter of English being my primary language. Going back into Spanish means going back into the language that I still speak with my family. All my phone calls to family are in Spanish.
Okay.
Spanish is a language I learned to pray in, but it wasn't what I learned to write in.
Okay.
I've had to slowly over the years learn to write in it and learning where the accents are. But then as I learn it, I have to go back and be like, well, how do I talk to my parents? Because in my writing in English, it's also like, well, the real chemical for a good poem is human voice. So you always want to sound have something voice driven. So my Spanish has been coming together. Like I think I told you, I'm working on a book of poems in Spanish. And one of the things I'm finding out is that I think I'm funnier in Spanish than I am in English.
Really?
Because in English, it's such a, when I bring Spanish and I do a kind of Spanglish mix in a poem, there's interrogation that happens. There's a self-awareness that happens of the ways, the power of language, but also the things that can't be said in one language versus another.
Right.
And for myself, the metaphor is like very obvious. Like my mom had me really young. She was 14. And I'm first generation, first person to graduate from high school on through the PhD.
Right.
And so there's a whole world of like that I've been exposed to that she has no experience in, and so there's that distance. And then along with this new world of mine, or the world that I've been exposed to, it's a whole world of language that she's not exposed to. And so the conversations I have about my mom in my poems are about that, are kind of sometimes celebrating, sometimes mourning, sometimes just interrogating what that distance means. When I say celebrating, it's like sometimes it's celebrating the fact that we can connect despite distance, emotional, physical, and linguistic.
That's heartening. I was afraid you were going to go the other way, and this sounds like that you being so capable actually increased the distance between you, or maybe is a point of division, but it sounds like it's not.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it's family. We always want to work towards family.
Oh, you bet. So, you know what I think, I don't know this, but I suspect in any language there are puns,
Yes.
a play on words. So when you say that you feel like maybe you're more humorous in Spanish, does it have anything to do with that, or is it an outlook, or?
Well, I mean, especially coming at it, like my own stew is bilingual. I have a history of poems in English, and then using that mind that wrote those poems and applying it to writing poems in Spanish.
Okay.
It becomes just attention to language. Like that's one of the things that I will say is the same in both.
Okay.
I find a word in English that I could become fascinated by. It becomes maybe the grounding keystone of a poem. And the same thing in Spanish. It's like if I find a word that I'm like, ooh, I want to play with that a little.
Right.
So.
Well, when we talked last time, and I mentioned this, but I'd like to just explore it a little bit more. English doesn't have gender, or the nouns don't have a gender.
Oh yeah.
And I wondered, can you use that? Do you use that when you write in Spanish?
I would say just the rules are different. Like
Okay.
in the same way, you can't say the same way that I believe the Spanish language is gendered. Like it's not that English doesn't have like gender. It's that it just has a different set of rules.
Okay.
Because there's both linguists and people who study and write about poetic prosody. They'll tell you like, oh well, the sounds of words, like a word that ends in a harsh sound in English,
Yes.
is a masculine sound, and then a softer like water or is considered like liquid or feminine. So gender sneaks in. I mean, there's troubled ideas of gender have been in all sorts of language.
Okay.
But it is something to pay attention to. In the same way, like you have to pay attention to in English. I think you can write these longer sentences and compound them. At least in my English. In Spanish, gender is one of those rules where it's like, hey, you can write freely, except for you gotta make sure these things line up, because people who read Spanish or talk Spanish will be expecting that.
Okay.
So each language has its expectations. I think that's where it's what I'm most familiar with and what I ground my writing in.
Yeah. Okay. Our producer Caroline had given me an article, and I think I'm remembering this correctly, that I think the word bridge in German is feminine, and I believe that it's masculine in Spanish. Am I correct?
Yeah. Well, what is it? It's puente, and is there I guess it would be puente or puenta if we were to play that game.
Okay.
Well, even then, like there's some fun to be had. One of my favorite things. So the point is, it is masculine in Spanish, I believe,
Okay.
puente. But one of the things I love about the Spanish language is that you can have puente, and then you want to verb it. You can be like, oh well, I bridged. I bridged myself.
Right.
Fue un puentazo. Me puentí. Like, and that's not correct Spanish, but it is the kind of fun that poets and
okay,
people,
sure. Yeah.
yeah. So it's like, I guess in English it would be like, I bridged it myself. And people would be like, well, that's not how you use the word bridge.
Right.
It's like, well, that's one of the reasons where, as poets, we would do something like that.
Right. So I like that, and my point originally with the gender was that if bridge in German is feminine, then the words to describe bridge tend to be words like graceful, flowing, and so on. Or in Spanish, because it's masculine, the adjectives would be strong, stout, things like that.
I don't know if I met a graceful bridge.
Okay.
In German,
of course,
are there
because you're speaking Spanish, that's why.
are there graceful bridges in German? Okay.
But that was I don't speak German either, but that's what I read, and I guess to some extent it would follow that if the bridge was feminine, that you would see it as graceful, and which leads me back to the poetry. That's the thing, is I keep thinking when it seems like, boy oh boy, if I don't know, but if a mountain is masculine and the sky is feminine, could you do something with that relationship that you couldn't do in English?
I think you could do something like that in English too. Like
Okay.
especially because gender is a construct, and so the way we talk about Spanish being gendered, it's more that word applies in terms of the linguistic rules of it, but in terms of like applying gender to the sky versus and another gender to like the earth, like you could easily say father sky as much as you could say mother sky.
Okay, sure.
It just depends what your context is and what the project is. So.
Okay. And I was just thinking, we used to name hurricanes, we give them feminine names, we don't do that anymore. So before we get too far here, I really wanted you to read a couple of works.
Of course.
And I think, well, you have them picked out.
I do. I first want to read a poem from my Spanish book of poems that I'm working on. And this one recently got published in an online journal called Hinchas de Poesía. And the poem is in a series of what I call practical translations, traducción prácticas. And what that means is it's me having fun.
Okay.
So for this one, the title is Thank You for Not Smoking. And so I give it a practical translation. And I think this project came out of seeing all these signs in my life in English that are very stark. Or in the case of Thank You for Not Smoking, it seems very eloquent. Like, oh, thank you for, like, but also you think about it, it's like very passive aggressive. Because what you're saying is, hey, don't smoke.
Right.
But no one will like, don't smoke as a sign.
Right.
But so thank you for not smoking seems very polite. So you're like, oh, okay. But then I would see these English signs translated into Spanish in a very clunky way. And I'm like, well, there's something there. So I chased it. Right?
Okay.
And so this is Thank You for Not Smoking, una traducción práctica. Gracias por no esconder el sol detrás de mensajes de oscuridad y ceniza. Gracias por no ser ceniza. Gracias por ser más tranquilo, más quieto, más en tu lugar que el niño agreste que es la lumbre. Por tener humildad, por no estar avergonzado y no tener nada que ver con el fuego, ni con lo que se torna calor y luz. Gracias por aceptar tu posición en el universo, por saber que si uno no brilla, no significa necesariamente que le falta luz. Gracias por controlarte, por no ser tan hambriento que te comes tu propio cuerpo, con un hambre tan fuerte que todo lo que deja atrás es una bandera más gris que blanco y que significa la entrega a la mala salud, o peor, piel fea. Gracias por no molestar a la boca con un cigarrillo como palabra huevona o indecisa, por no pasar por la nariz como el áspero aliento de una persona enojada, por tener más confianza en los brazos que en las brasas. So if you know Spanish, that was hilarious. But if you don't, so in terms of our conversation, some of the play I'm having here is I take Thank You for Not Smoking, and the first line is, thank you for not hiding the sun behind messages of obscurity and ash. Thank you for not being ash. Thank you for being more tranquil, quieter, more in your place than the kid or than the child that is the I guess it would be like agreste, like fussy child that is the flame. And so I'm kind of like going very poetic, very romantic with the language. And then at the very end, the last line, por tener más confianza en los brazos que en las brasas. So brazos is arms,
Oh,
and brasas is coals. So like embers of coal.
sure.
And so the last three lines are, thank you for having more confidence in arms than in embers. So like the phrase, thank you for not smoking, in this practical translation is like very grandiose, is my my play with it.
Okay. Well, I liked it,
Yeah.
and I don't speak Spanish.
And you don't speak it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'd wanted to share a book from my latest, or a poem from my latest book,
Yeah.
Until We're Level Again. That's kind of pertinent to our conversation. The poem is called Speaking Spanish on the Streets of New York City. And it relates to what we were talking about in terms of like one of the things I'm always writing about is writing and language, and the two languages I live in. And when I give readings, I always tell people, or I always tell the audience, I'm like, there's one good line in this poem, and it's the line in Spanish that I borrow from another poet. And this is a poet named Pedro Miguel Obligado, and his line in the poem is, Mi vida es una rama que a tu paso deshojas. And that translates to, my life is a branch that, when you pass, unleaves. And it gets tricky because this hojas in Spanish, like a literal translation that I would run with would be unleaves, but it means like loses its leaves or
Right.
something.
Yeah.
So then it becomes one of those, a translator would have to play that game. And like I said, I didn't grow up reading Spanish, only speaking it with my family and praying in it. So when I first started reading poems in Spanish, it would be in bilingual editions. And as much as I struggled with the Spanish, I would look over at the English and I'd be like, it's not right. Like,
Even you knew, even as you were learning.
yeah.
Yeah.
It was both the Spanish speaker in me, but also the poet in me. It was like, I want to,
Make it better.
I want to make that better. I want to, yeah. And so that's one of the conversations in my writing life that that influences my work.
Yeah.
So I'll read this.
All right.
This is the last poem in the book. Speaking Spanish on the streets of New York City. I want to believe they are not speaking Spanish, this mother and son, so much like the mother and son in photographs back in Texas, but they are. I want to believe the boy has lost no father, the mother never had to explain being broke, nor our bodies break, that they speak only sunlight, speak held hands, speak city traffic, speak flags of many countries. I want to believe they are not filled with the same words in which I lost my father, words my mother cried through later, explaining about a man she left and how she'd never leave me. The same words shuffled out as I explained I had to leave. Words moving the air between us, words holding over the miles, words letting through all we mean to each other. I want to believe, but know they speak in the same words I have to keep to myself. Words mumbled in the park, taking the shape of, mi vida es una rama que a tu paso deshojas. I know the words they speak, but not what the words mean between the stranger I am now and this mother and son.
Well, I only disagree in that there's more than one good line in that. No, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Appreciate that.
This reminds me in a way of a designer. My dad was an inventor and a designer. And he used to say, you can't invent something just because you want to invent something. There has to be a need that you're addressing. And for me, when I write inspiration or whatever, that it has to be, I have to be moved by something. Can you just sit down and say, you know, I need to keep my skills sharp, I'm going to write a poem?
Oh yeah, well, one, I agree with what your dad said. And then I'm immediately in my head as you were saying, and I was just like, oh, we have, poems should address a need. Like, poems do address needs. The good ones do. But I will also say, like, I write every day, and it's not always gold. It is 99% not gold. I don't think I'm a good writer. I think I'm a good editor. That's over about 20 years now of writing, of having a writing life and pursuing a career of poetry and now nonfiction and fiction. my editing skills have gotten really well. Like I know how to like take a first draft and really go over it and push it and for the ideas that it could be.
Sure.
But in terms of my, let me think about this. Like the context of need, even the daily writing when it's not spectacular, for me it does feed a certain need, in that it makes me feel more grounded, like on a given day, and that's a very personal thing.
Of course.
And I always tell my students like everything should start personal. We were talking earlier about your new book coming out. It's like you got to be the first cheerleader for your own work, and it happens even on this inner level, because that's an outward sentiment. So on an inner level, my writing a bad 4-line poem on a given day does something for me that day, meets a need, but it becomes art as soon as I come back to it a week later or a year later and look at those 4 lines. I'm like, what else could they be? Suddenly it becomes like, well, writing a poem for someone else, writing a poem, like really moving it towards art rather than something personal.
Okay.
So yeah, but I think James Wright, the poet James Wright, put it in terms of writing equals like emotional security, and I think that's some of my writing every day is kind of grounded in that. William Stafford is famous for writing every day, and I think his thing is just like you have to lower your standards. And I'm like, and that applies here too, because it's like lower your standards. Like, does it meet a big need, or does it meet a small need?
Right.
So,
well, good. Jose, thank you
Of
so
course.
much. We're out of time again, but we'll just have to do it once more.
hey, if we need to, sure.
All right, thank you. Folks, that's it for The Writing Life. This time, I'm Stephen W. Long. I encourage you to write to me at stephenwlong.com. And if you have suggestions, either for a guest or for a topic, we'd love to hear from you. And we'll just see you next time on The Writing Life. Thanks.
What do you think? We done?
I don't know, you guys wanna do one just with yourself without me doing the
As long as they think we're done, if
No,
they got
no.
enough, they got enough.
They got enough? Probably, okay, sounds good.
Let's go lunch.
Oh.
I'm hungry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I could just bite too.